I'm Shinobu Kitayama. I'm a professor in psychology, and I'm the associate assistant, whichever director, associate director of the Center for Japanese Studies. I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce Greg today. Greg Laurence had got a PhD several years ago, 2010, from Syracuse University. And ever since then, he's working in the general area of management and organizational behavior. And he's particularly interested in well-being and stress in work settings. And today, he's going to share with us his work he has done on this topic in China and Japan. So help me welcome Greg.
So my name is Greg Laurence. As said, I am at the University of Michigan-Flint and have been there since 2010. Currently chair of the Department of Management and Marketing, which also includes supply chain management, but for some reason we don't include them in our name. Who knows why? And am sort of broadly interested in different kinds of things related to work in Japan. I worked there myself for about 10 years before doing my PhD. Actually, I worked before my MBA, after my MBA, and then came back for a PhD as well. So, and I'll sort of talk about how some of those experiences influence the things that I do in terms of my research as we go along. One thing I guess I would kind of like to know, you like to get a sense of your room. So how many of you all are like businessy people? Okay, a few who, all right, that's good. And then others would be in what areas, if you can just.
Japanese studies.
Japanese studies,
Asian studies.
Asian studies,
Engineering.
engineering. Okay, that's cool. So a bunch of different things. Art, great. All right. So what that generally indicates, right, is that I'm going to start off with what I guess I'd like to call sort of deep background on the paper. So my PhD is in management, which is kind of a super broad field in a way. We have within that field kind of three main focus areas, two of which are sort of on the macro side of things where you look at companies and industries, and one on the micro side where you look at people and teams. I'm on the micro side. I'm interested in what people and teams are doing and the experiences of people at work, and that's sort of broadly what the notion of organizational behavior is. When I teach the organizational behavior class for undergraduate students, I often start off by saying this is not about how organizations behave, even though the name might suggest that, right? Rather, it's about how people behave when working in organizations, which I find to be kind of interesting. And again, I'll tell you a couple of stories that kind of indicate why that might be as we go along. Within that field, right, one of the kind of important areas of research is around what jobs are and how they are designed. If we think about it, the notion of the job as we sort of experience them these days is a relatively new thing, right, in the human experience. Back in sort of agrarian days, people would have done pretty much everything around the house, make their own clothes, make their own supplies, this and that and the other. And it's really not until organizations start forming and companies start forming that this sort of notion of figuring out what a job is starts to happen. And for a long time, the notion was that, okay, your company is going to design the jobs and they tell you what to do, and that's the job you do. And we'll see that sort of notion is kind of changing, or we're reinterpreting that these days in kind of the modern area of OB. Within then this notion of like what are jobs and how are they designed, one of the things we're really concerned about is why are people motivated or not to do particular jobs. I think this is really interesting one. And this one gets to sort of some of my experiences working. I suppose, the kind of employee who never was like super excited to be working. Um, the whole sort of idea of being like really excited about a particular job, or being really connected to an organization and feeling like, wow, this is the greatest place in the world to work, and I'm super pumped to be here, was never me, right? So that working with people who I saw who were acting that way, it was always fascinating to me, and I was like, what is wrong with these people, really, right? Like, why do they want to work so much? Wouldn't they rather be, I don't know, doing anything, practicing a musical instrument, riding a bicycle, whatever? So why is it that people are motivated to do the jobs that they do is sort of a question that fascinates me. And there are a number of theories about this, right? So a guy named Frederick Herzberg came up long ago with this notion of this two-factor theory, where he says, all right, there are things about a job that motivate you, most importantly, like what is the work itself that you're doing, and there are other things about a job that simply exist to keep you from being dissatisfied, right? And he would have put like money, salary, as one of these hygiene factors, where if you're paid a certain amount, you're not going to be dissatisfied. If you're paid less than that, you're going to be dissatisfied, but that's not going to contribute to sort of your happiness in the job. There's another sort of important theory in this area by a guy named Victor Vroom, who, if I'm right, got his PhD here, called expectancy theory, right, which says essentially, right, that if I try hard in my job, if I put in some effort, then I'm going to perform well. And if I perform well, there's going to be some outcome, probably that's of value to me, right? And that's what's going to motivate me to do my job, is that if I try hard, I will do well, and then I'll get rewarded for that in some way. And then sort of the most recent of these, and the one that ends up influencing where I'm doing this work on job crafting, is the notion of the job characteristics model, or job characteristics theory. And this sort of says, Hackman and Oldham say, all right, any job you can think of, right, has these 5 characteristics, right? They're either high or low on these things. So any job you can think of has skill variety. You knew a number of different skills in your job. Maybe it's a job where if you're working on an assembly line and you're turning a nut as some product goes by, your skill variety is pretty low, right? But it exists. Task identity, do you understand what it is that you're doing in sort of the grand scheme of things? Task significance, does what you're doing have some meaning for other people, for the system? Feedback from the job, which is maybe the only one of these that's sort of confusing, right? This is not feedback where your boss tells you, good job, good job. Rather, it is the job you're doing itself giving you information about whether you're doing the job well or not, right? If I looked out at all of you and saw that you were all already eyes glazed over and gone to sleep, I might have some idea, right, of how I'm doing my job, whether good or bad. And of course, autonomy. To what degree do you have like freedom to decide how you do your job, when you do your job, where you do your job, those kinds of things. So any job you can think of has those 5 characteristics. They impact you psychologically. How they impact you psychologically then will predict things like job satisfaction and whether you want to quit your job, and those sorts of things. So these are kind of some important aspects of motivation. Here we are, though, right, in the 20th and 21st centuries, where we're in an era where many fewer people are working, say, in really mechanistic factories and whatnot than they used to. There's a whole variety of different kinds of jobs and workspaces out there. And so there are some different ideas going on about how people are motivated and how they stay motivated in the jobs that they do. And so this is sort of where my research starts to come into play. So where did this particular study come from, right? So I have a couple of stories here. One, I guess I alluded to a minute ago, which is there's this old saying, right? Do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Would you guys generally agree? Okay. How many of you have never experienced this feeling? I'm going to raise my hand, right? I'm going to say, like, this is definitely not me. When I go to work, like, I feel like I'm going to work. I'm not the type who's like going, yeah, no, I'm a professor. It's so great. I don't feel like I'm working. Nope, I feel like I'm working. But, you know, other people have different kinds of experiences. So that, I think, is part of the reason that I study what I study here. The other goes to a little story that I'll tell you about my life as an assistant band director. So my first job out of college, right, was teaching English conversation at one of the big Eikaiwa schools in Japan, and I did that for 4 years. And I thought, boy, you know, I think I might like to get a master's degree in linguistics and maybe do this for the really long term. But if I'm gonna do that, I think I should teach in a different context, right? That is it the teaching of English that I enjoy, or do I just sort of enjoy being in this context in the Eikaiwa, and that kind of atmosphere is a good fit for me. So I got a job teaching at a private junior and senior high school in Kochi Prefecture that some of you may know has a famous baseball team and really good sumo wrestlers. So anyway, and I went there because it had a famous baseball team, and that would get me to Koshien, and sort of that was my goal with taking that job, right? Anyway, one of the kind of unwritten expectations of the job of English teacher at this high school was that you would be one of the coaches of the drama club, right? And the high school drama club there, they did Shakespeare in English, and it was this, you know, sort of a major production. Well, I had no particular interest in the theater, horrible stage fright, no real interest in doing that job. And I looked around, right, at the school after I got there, and I saw, wait a minute, they have a band, right? And I was in the band in high school and college. I think I would rather spend my time helping out with the band than helping out with the drama club. So I didn't go to drama club practice after school, and I went to band practice instead. And eventually, there I am as the assistant band director at this high school, despite not having any real training in doing that. But it was something I would rather do than work as the theater director, right? So I'm sitting there like, wow, this is really cool. I don't have to go to theater practice. But these questions going through my mind, right? Okay, why did I make this? Why did I really make that change to my job? And why did my coworkers, why did my boss, why did the principal of the school let me do it, right? If there was this sort of expectation that you would be the helping out with the drama club. Why didn't the other English teacher get like up in my face about not helping him out with the drama club, right? Like he was just like, yeah, okay, go off and do your own thing. Maybe he was upset about it, maybe he wasn't. We never had the conversation. So those were all happening while I was working there. I didn't have any sort of parameters to think about this in any sort of systematic way until years later when I got into graduate school and found this concept, right, of job crafting, which now sort of puts a definition to what I did, right? So what is job crafting? That's kind of at the center of this paper, and it is changes that individuals make to the task or relational environments and boundaries of their work, all right? So you might look around your workplace and see something that you think needs to be done and nobody's doing it, and so you start doing it. Maybe you decide to do things differently than your predecessor has done them because some other process for doing the work makes more sense to you. Maybe you meet new people, make an effort to make different relationships in the work, those kinds of things, right? So what you're doing is changing those job characteristics that I talked about, right? So you're given this job and it has a particular set of skills that you use to do the job. You look around and you say, no, I want to do this job differently than it has been done, and right, so now your skill variety changes. And because you have made that decision to do it. You can also change the way that your job is sort of cognitively framed. The famous example of this that Amy Wisniewski and Jane Dutton wrote about in their paper on this is talking about hospital janitorial staffs and how they will oftentimes reframe their job as an integral part of the patient care process, right? Rather than scrubbing floors. And that this changes sort of their perspective on the job and changes the meaning of the job in a really important and profound sort of way. So that's one way that you can go about doing that thing. It's a pretty important extension of that job design context, right? Because jobs now can no longer be seen as something that only the management and only the company is designing. That we as individuals, right, are going through sort of a in the background redesign process of the jobs that we do after we're given the jobs. One of the major, long term, one of the major problems that it causes is that when you quit your job, right, and the company has to look for your replacement, they're no longer looking for the replacement for someone to do what the job description says, right, because you've changed it. And they probably want somebody to come in and do what you were doing, not what they hired you to do 10 years ago. So sort of an interesting problem for companies to deal with. Whether you'd expect it or not, this is a pretty pervasive thing. Research out there shows essentially virtually everyone does this. In at least that one Lyons papers, he reports 75% of the people that he talked to as part of his research having reported doing this in at least in the last 12 months. And it's pretty consistent, right? That it's not the kind of thing you do once and then you're satisfied with the job and you leave it as is, but that you're kind of continually going to make changes over time. And if it's pervasive and consistent, it's probably one of those things that we should know a little bit more about. What we have not known very much about up to this point is, okay, why do people do it? And why do some people do it more or more often than other people? And this was sort of the major question that we were trying to look at here. Since we're sort of talking about Japan and China, it is kind of an interesting thing to think about, like, well, why might this happen in Japan, right? The concept theoretically is designed to sort of suggest that it's a universal, right? It was developed here in the West and until recently has only really been tested in US, Canadian, European kind of contexts. There is this interesting paper that's just out by Kim and colleagues. They collected data roughly around the same time that I did, but in South Korea. So it seems like the concept is getting some traction in non-Western contexts, which is nice to see. Good to see that we can sort of generalize beyond that. There might, though, be some problems, right, maybe with trying to study this in the Japanese and Chinese contexts. Some of the things that we thought about were, okay, if the cultures are more collectivistic than in the US, does sort of a concern for the group, is that going to be associated with more or less job crafting in the context? And this was it was an open question, but one that we were sort of concerned about when we started. And then, of course, the fact that Japan's a pretty high context culture. Companies have job descriptions that are vague at best and in lots of cases kind of non-existent. And of course, a lot of companies don't have really individual titles for people, right? You work in some boo or the other, but what's your title within there? It's kind of a vague thing. And so we also were actually a little bit worried that maybe employees aren't even going to recognize that they're doing this. That if you ask people, hey, are you engaging in these activities? It was, well, I'm not doing anything special, so no, right? Like that was always sort of a worry in the back of our mind. So it was eventually good to see that, in fact, people recognize that they're doing this, and we find people do it. Okay, so what are the motivations that we were interested in? There are two main ones. One is enjoyment of work, right? Do people like the work that they're doing? This is an intrinsic sort of an internal motivation that one might have. The degree to which individuals work because they find interest in it. It's associated, importantly, right, with passionate involvement in your work. It's associated with doing more work, having a higher workload, and with finding new skills, building a new skill set, broadening your skill set at work. So all of those things, right, combine to sort of suggest that people who enjoy work more should engage in more job crafting. That's sort of the idea that we were after, right? Somebody notices something isn't being done, they say, hey, that looks interesting, I'm going to do that. And they add new skills, or they add new tasks, or they add new responsibilities to their own workplace. In sort of parallel to this is what's known in self-determination theory an introjected motivation of being driven to work. And an introjected motivation is also internal to the individual, but if you think about intrinsic motivation as being internal and sort of positive, right? Like I like the work that I'm doing, I feel really good about it. Introjected is internal and sort of negative, and revolves around this notion that you feel basically compelled to work and guilty when you're not. Now, I'll throw this out there, right? How many of us have been on vacation, you're sitting on the beach, trying to enjoy a cocktail, and you're like, I wonder what's going on at work, right? Like you kind of, no, maybe not. Yeah. So you sort of feel bad because you're not there and you're not doing the work, and it's like, oh, I really should do that thing that's like sitting over my head. And we all sort of, to some degree, right, feel that kind of a thing. And this feeling becomes associated with less delegation or sharing of responsibilities, right? If I feel like I ought to be doing this, it's very difficult for me to say, hey, why don't you do that? Because now I'm going to feel like, you know. So you're less likely to share and delegate responsibilities. Higher levels of conscientiousness and perfectionism, right? Like you want the job to be done just so. And if it's not being done just so, then you're going to fix that, right? By saying, well, I should do that thing, rather than let someone else do it. Maybe for folks who are still students, if you're working in group projects, right, and you're really reluctant to let anyone else do the work, right? So you get real worried about whether it's getting done, and so you do more than you maybe should. As
Don't do it.
well, yeah, there is that problem, right? That they're maybe not motivated to work, right? And so they leave it to other people. In any event, right? So driven to work should be positively related to job crafting also. Now, this starts to get fun when you think about the fact that you feel some level of enjoyment of work and you feel some level of this drivenness to work at the same time, right? We're kind of humans, and we don't only have one type of motivation going on in our minds at once. These things tend to kind of interact with each other, and so we expect, right, there to be this kind of one affecting the other in a way. And I think the important one, right, is the second half of this, that if you're lower in this driven to work kind of a feeling, then whether you enjoy work or not, there's not going to be that sort of extra kick from the drivenness, right? Like I enjoy my work, but when I go home from it, if I don't feel compelled, like I'll play video games or whatever else. So the there's that sort of feeling like, yeah, okay, I like my job just enough. I'll do a little bit more of it. But if I don't have that compulsion, if I don't have that drive, if I don't have that feeling of guilt of things not being done, then that power of the enjoyment of work, right, should get weakened. We would also hope, right, that if you do more things at work, if you expand your skill set, if you're taking on tasks that aren't being done, or you're doing tasks better than they could be done by other people, that hopefully, right, your boss is going to recognize this and say, great job, right? Improved performance, at least as perceived by the boss, you hope comes out of that. And that sort of suggests this kind of model of this process that we're looking at, and implies, right, at the end of the day, that enjoyment of work should impact performance through that pathway. Does that make sense? All right. So this is kind of what we were out there trying to test and see if it was happening in the Japanese and Chinese contexts. So I went out and I collected some data. Luckily, had a number of friends and colleagues in Japan, and then one of my co-authors who had a friend in China who allowed us access to their companies, and we went in, surveyed folks, and paired up people with their bosses, right? So that the people would tell us what they're doing in terms of job crafting, whether they like their job, whether they're driven or not, and then we got the bosses to tell us what the performance side of that thing was. So I had 154 of these pairs of folks in the two countries. Interestingly, right, all the supervisors that we asked were all like, "Yeah, sure, I'll fill this out. How interesting!" And many less of the employees helped out, which is sort of an interesting thing. There's sort of some information about them. 68% male, average age of 32. Majority unmarried. I find interesting that people had worked for their companies for about 6 years and they'd been in their individual positions for an average of 4, which is very likely different from what we would have found in the United States. From the research that I see, it seems like people are changing positions much more often than every 4 years on average. Folks working on an average of over 45 hours a week, and most had continued their education beyond high school. There was no difference between the Japanese and Chinese groups on that, which is kind of an interesting finding as well. How did we measure this stuff, right? So enjoyment of work and driven to work are measured by, this gets sort of complex. There's a survey called the Workaholism Battery by Spence and Robbins. Kanai, Wakabayashi, and Fling did the Japanese translation of that in 96, I think. Yes, that's right. And in the years since then, some folks have said, you don't need to use all of those questions. Let's cut this thing down. And so we use the short version of that. That's much more popular these days than it used to be. For job crafting, we took some scales that were about those job characteristics, right? Like about task significance and task identity and task skill variety autonomy, and reworded those from my job is this to I have changed my job regarding this, right? So we reworded that to indicate that sort of proactive kind of change process to focus on those 4 aspects of that. Supervisor job performance, this was 3, 4, 5 questions, I don't remember exactly, on how well this person performs compared to other people in the work group. And then because we were looking at different people in different organizations, controlled for the company, controlled for nationality, supervisor, the length of time that they had worked for their company, you might think in that case, right, like if you're just new at your company, maybe you can't change your job because you're like worried that if you do, it's going to look bad, right? you've just started, you're just learning it. If you make too many changes too early on, that might cause a problem. On the other hand, if you've been there a long time, you may have already made all of the changes and got the job just the way you want it, and now it's like, okay, I'm not touching it anymore. So the length of time that you've been in the company is kind of important, controlled for gender and education as well. This is where I'm going to lose all of the non-businessy people, right? Because the statistics going to be like, ugh. The statistics start to get it's not that bad, but so we used a partial least squares structural equation model, which is a fancy schmancy kind of regression analysis, and these hypotheses, right? So enjoyment of work does in fact lead to more job crafting. Being driven to work does in fact lead to more job crafting. The interaction of the two is significant, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second so you can see exactly how it's working. And then job crafting does predict performance as we might have expected. And in the really fancy stuff, that moderated mediation path analysis, right? So this notion that the enjoyment of work impacts performance on the other side through all of that stuff, and depending on the level of driven to work, is also statistically significant, right? Here's how the interaction looks, and for those of you who have not seen this kind of thing before, I can kind of explain, right? So enjoyment of work is increasing as we go across that way, right? And job crafting is increasing this way. So you see that as enjoyment of work goes up, people are doing more job crafting, right? Like that first hypothesis suggested. However, right, the lines are different depending on whether that driven to work is high or low, right? The slope of the line is different. And in fact, this slope that looks like it's going up, the statistics tell us is not actually going up, right? That slope is equivalent to 0. Okay, whereas this one, the slope is not equivalent to 0, it's actually going up, okay? Which suggests then, right, that when you have that low driven to work, whether you enjoy work more or less doesn't matter, right? No drive to work, no compulsion to work, no feeling those feelings of guilt means that the amount of job crafting you do won't change, whether you like work, even if you like work more. Right? So it has this sort of canceling out effect if you're not the kind of person who feels that compulsion to work, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? So increased enjoyment of work is associated with more job crafting when driven to work is high, but as we thought, right, when that's low, you have that kind of damping effect, and the enjoyment of work doesn't really matter. We did find something kind of interesting too. We had this unhypothesized finding, which is that the nationality variable was significant. So where do you guys think, Japan, China, who's doing more of this? Japan, okay. Japan is correct. Why?
Because
maybe.
China won't even let you have Google.
All right, so maybe
Like,
China
if
is
you
its...
if you get arrested for using Google, I mean, if you change your job too much, no one's ever going to see you again.
Okay, so it could be that the culture is a little more restrictive in a way. Yeah.
Perhaps it's because Japan has steadily developed into a post-industrial nation.
And
China, meanwhile, is in some parts still industrializing.
okay.
So because of that, there might be more of the like rigid job structure in place that comes with strong hierarchies
Okay.
and unskilled labor.
So the kinds of jobs that are being done in the two countries may allow for more job crafting in one case and not so much more in another. That's an interesting idea. Okay. We were sort of interested in, okay, well, let's think about this little broadly, right? And what might some cultural things point to. The Project Globe cultural variables, there are, I think, 9 of them. 2 that looked like they might be important. One is this notion of uncertainty avoidance, and that being much higher in China suggests maybe that you get a little bit concerned. The Chinese are a little more concerned about, well, what happens if I change the job, right? Like, what's the reaction of my coworkers going to be? What's the reaction of my supervisors going to be? I'm not sure, so I'm not going to do it. Okay, that's one potential possibility. Future orientation, higher in Japan than in China. Maybe that suggests, right, people thinking about, okay, what's my next job going to be? And if I make changes to the current one, it allows me to build some skills that are transferable to a future job, maybe, right? That could be. The more common Hofstede cultural values, there are a couple there that maybe are interesting. Power distance, right, which is the degree to which you expect power and decisions to be made in a hierarchical manner, is much higher in China than in Japan. So maybe this sort of proactive changing of the job is less of a thing, right? You're expecting your boss to say, you go do that, rather than kind of doing it in a proactive sort of way. And interestingly, right, Japan's actually somewhat higher on individualism than is China. And that may predict making proactive individual decisions about your job rather than sort of going with the collectivistic flow. So those are some interesting speculations. What you'd have to do, I think, is to go and look maybe at a larger study with a couple of other countries where you could actually survey people about those cultural values and see whether those are actually impacting the practice. With 2 countries, that's a little difficult to do because you really only have the binary numbers to look at. And since the country effect is there would be an effect of those things you would expect.
What sort of scale were those numbers on?
So this one's 1 to 7.
Okay.
That one's up to 100.
Okay. Okay.
Without violating any privacy-related rules and regulations or even national laws, would you please give us as detailed information as you possibly can about the characteristics of, I assume, 2 companies, one in China, one in Japan, in terms of, for example,
Mm-hmm.
size of company?
Sure.
You know, you can go from revenue to number of employees,
Mhm.
number of factories, location of the business within China, within Japan. I think it matters, at least from urban versus rural perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Whether the company is public, that is publicly traded or private, the incentive system in place in these 2 respective companies, population of the employee, and perhaps other relevant factors in your opinion.
Sure. Okay. So let's see. So China will be interesting because in China it is in fact only 1 company. In Japan there were more than 1. The Chinese company is a privately held software development firm in Beijing. If I'm remembering correctly, something on the order of 350 employees. We had 65 or 70 of them respond. Japan's kind of a mix. One of the companies is an accounting firm in Fukushima, and then the other 3 were Tokyo-based, 2 consulting companies and 1 nonprofit. One of the consulting companies was quite, I guess, in my opinion, quite large, about 150 or so employees. The other one quite small, 6 or 7. And then the nonprofit has probably about 30 employees. I don't know, the incentive system is an interesting question, and I don't know very much about those. But the companies that I'm sort of very familiar with within the sample would not have had anything built into their incentive system that would have either encouraged or discouraged these kinds of behaviors. The software company is maybe an interesting one because that company, right, you would think is more of an entrepreneurial sort of an organization where maybe there's an attitude of do whatever needs to be done for the company to be successful, right? Even in that context, though, we're seeing less of the job changes than you do in the Japanese contexts where the companies are older and less entrepreneurial. So does that help?
That helps.
Okay. All right. Any other questions before I get?
How do you define what a job change is, and what is considered material and not material?
So the surveys, I suppose, left that in a way up to the respondents. I mean, they were worded in a way that said, like, I have taken steps to increase the number of skills that I use on a daily basis at my job, or I have taken steps to understand how my job fits into the larger process within the company. So they were relatively specific in that sense. But in a lot of ways, the whether the change was made is the employee's perception of whether they made a change. It would be interesting, right, to compare the employees' reports of how much they have done against supervisors' impressions of whether anything has changed or not, to see whether supervisors actually see that people are making the same kinds of changes that people report making. That question wasn't included, wasn't in the survey, so I don't know. But that would be a really interesting sort of future research opportunity, right? Is to see if you're a supervisor and you have a sense of what this job is, right? Is the change that somebody's making of what's the magnitude of that from the perspective of the boss? I think that would be a really interesting question to look at, and really interesting to get at where those cognitive changes are concerned, right? If the person is really reframing how they think about their job and how they frame the job in their mind, it's entirely possible that your supervisor doesn't know you're doing that, really. They may recognize a performance change and be like, wow, what came over this person? They're doing such a better job than they used to, but not have a sense that it's because you've redefined the job in a more meaningful way.
What's your rationale behind the fact that you merged the 4 Japanese companies that are in a service-related industry in Tokyo versus an IT company in Beijing?
The really simple answer: convenience. That's where I had access to data, and was able to get.
What's the reason in order to merge them into one sample?
It kept the N at a sample size that I could work with.
70% Japanese or 80% Japanese?
60 something,
or
yeah.
60, 70%. That's enough in order to do the same analysis.
I don't know. I mean, it would have been what, 70 people,
So,
70 dyads.
so
That's
you're using PLS. You're over 30, so
that could be true. I should try it, I suppose.
it is true. Are you familiar with Dr. Iguchi's work at Toda in the medical school on job crafting in Japan?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
It's the name kind of rings a bell, but I'd have to look at my citation list and see if he's in there.
He's been doing this for 5 or 6 years with his
Hmm.
as a project.
Mostly in Japanese language journals, or is he?
Yeah, mostly. He's in a medical school, primarily stress-related research.
Right.
Right into what you're looking at.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so in terms of like some theoretical contributions as to what we've done, we do sort of give us a sense of what are the motivations for job crafting, what kind of things are leading people to do this, suggesting, right, some worker characteristics that are more or less associated with the practice. Finding, right, that job crafting is a significant contributor to job performance is a good thing. In fact, the Wisniewski and Dutton article is relatively agnostic about that and doesn't give us much of a prediction there. And you know, at least for our Western kind of journal audiences, this ability to generalize the practice beyond a Western context is important. It's also, like I said, nice to see that we have some colleagues doing the same in Korea. I would think for an organization, right, some of the things you may want to think about, you want to take into account characteristics of workers as you're making hiring decisions. If you have a more flexible work culture, then bringing in those people who you expect to be more likely to change their jobs is a good idea. So folks who express kind of that drivenness to work would be a good fit for more younger organizations, more entrepreneurial kinds of startups. Organizations with more rigid cultures may want to avoid the kind of compulsive workers and try and hire people who like to work, but not necessarily workaholics. And that's the kind of things that we're doing in that regard, and any other questions or comments would be appreciated. It's a fun area to be working in these days, that's for sure. Yeah.
So, first, thank you. I appreciate your talk very much. I was thinking a lot about how you had reported that there are more supervisors, of course, responding as opposed to employees. Is that related? Do you think there's any feeling of like maybe disenfranchisement? They don't have as much authority to change their job, at least as how they feel, because I don't know, supervisors are superiors, so I would imagine they feel like they have more ability to affect change. So was anything like that taken? Were the questions that were asked to supervisors in any way different from those that were asked to employees?
The questions asked of the supervisors were about their employees.
Right.
So tell me whether you're, and we asked some about the organizations themselves, like how rigid was the organization, how formal was the organization. We weren't asking the supervisors, for example, did you as a supervisor change your own job?
Okay, that's what I was getting
Right. So that you're right, like that may account for the lower response rate among employees, that they didn't feel like they could answer those questions, or maybe they didn't feel like they had the freedom to spend the time answering the questions, and so they didn't. It's sometimes figuring out why your response rate is lower for a group of employees is kind of a hard thing to do. Yeah.
So thank you for the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was very useful to raise my performance. My question is about the relationship between enjoyment and driven to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I understand that enjoyment is very important factor to have more job crafting and consequently the better performance. So, but and the driven to work is a discouraging factor. But I'm still not very sure how the person who feels driven to work a lot can have enjoyment of work. Personally, I can't.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, whether the enjoyment work, the result is, how is it possible that to have high enjoyment of work and
also
the driven to work, and I suspect that isn't it that who has the driven to work a lot is that does it result in the low enjoyment of work that lower the crafting and the performance?
And that's a really interesting question. So at least the way that if you were to look at like a scatter plot of the data, right? So if we just think about the way that people actually answer the questions, there are sort of roughly equal groups of respondents who are high on both, low on both, high on one or the other, right? So if you put them in quadrants, right, they're kind of relatively equal. So the number of people out there who are experiencing feelings like they like their work and they also feel compelled to work is like they exist. And so all of the data that I've seen where people are using these two scales will show, right, that they're conceptually different things. So it's not simply an artifact that the questions overlap so much that people who like one like another. I guess I'm kind of with you insofar as I find it difficult to imagine that feeling, right? That someone has when they feel both of those things at a very high level. People do, I guess, and at least the theoretical distinctiveness of enjoyment and driven is enough. I mean, that's clear, right? So I don't know if that's a really good answer to your question, but yeah, I personally, I'm with you. It's difficult to imagine feeling both, I think. I think I'm on the opposite, though, of you, maybe. I think I am more compelled to work than enjoy. I feel that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Greg. I learned a lot from you, and I feel like I should do more job crafting. Couple quick questions. So when you had the path diagram,
Yeah.
All the effects of driven to work and enjoyment of work went through job crafting, and then to job performance, right? And I was thinking that, well, enjoyment of work, driven to work, they should probably have more direct effect on job performance as well. And if you're running structural equations, you probably have both direct and indirect. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit. The second question is about China-Japan comparison. You went to sort of cultural explanations on that, and I'm wondering if you have more of a structural institutional explanations for that, because I'd imagine there are many more opportunities for Japanese employees to think about job crafting, professional workshops, consultants all over. So access to those institutions would probably shape the degree to which people actually go for job crafting. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah. So that first question on whether we're talking about a full mediation or a partial mediation, boy, I'll have to go look at the PLM results to let you know. My guess is, and even though we didn't hypothesize it, that you're right that it's a partial, and that there's probably a direct pathway from enjoyment to performance. It would be interesting. I don't know that anyone has discussed this theoretically. I mean, in a way, that seems almost like kind of becomes a halo effect in some ways, right? That if I'm your boss and I see that you really like your work and you're like happy to be here, that could kind of, what's the right word? Contaminate my impression of your performance. Does that make sense? And if I think that you're a workaholic and that you're compelled to work, also that's going to, oh wow, I mean, person's always here, right? So they must be doing a good job. So there's some danger there. I'll have to look and see whether folks have gotten into that. That institutional question is a really good one. We didn't really have any way of measuring that, but there are some interesting, I mean, obviously there are some really interesting things going on in Japan now compared to 20 years ago, right? That more people are moving around and changing jobs, and so some of these kind of freedoms that you might have inside Japanese companies may be quite different from in China. So that's a good question as well. It would be interesting to look at things like organizational rigidity and compare those two and see whether, does the opportunity to job craft influence job crafting as much as those motivations? Yeah, future research.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much. This is really interesting work that you're doing, and I think it's applicable too, which is cool. Could you go to the last slide of results and analysis with the Project Globe numbers and stuff? Yeah, that one there.
Yeah.
Okay, so just so I can contextualize these numbers, do you happen to know off the top of your head where like America or European countries would rate on this scale? Like just so I can kind of see what they mean.
Give me one sec.
Oh, did you look it up?
I pulled up the page like 5 minutes ago because I was really curious about this. Do you want the globe values or the
Hofstede.
that one?
How about the globe values?
Okay. I just closed the tab. I literally just closed it. Okay. Results. Let's see here. And we are looking at America, you want to do?
Sure.
Okay. Oh, USA. Wonderful. So, there's like a graph, so I can't really like.
That's okay.
Uncertainty avoidance for America is it's like at 4.
Yeah, I was gonna say lower here than there.
Okay.
And then future orientation is at like 5.5.
Okay.
6.
Cool.
Or yeah, like somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5.
Awesome. Yeah, that was all.
Yeah, power distance. If you go to Hofstede, power distance, the U.S. would be quite low.
Okay.
We tend to be very, like, egalitarian decision making, not so hierarchical, and individualism would be, I'm going to guess we're 80.
Oh wow. Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go, 95 out of 100, right? So, yeah, so quite.
What's the meaning of that number? 80 for China, and 50 for Japan?
Sure. So on a scale of 1 to 100, where.
What's the meaning of this number?
So, what's the meaning?
Why Chinese are higher than Japan?
So the Chinese expect decisions to be made in a hierarchical manner and for power to be held by some superior person, where Japanese expect that to be less the case.
91, excuse me, for individualism.
91.
40 for power distance.
40, so yeah, so US is 40, right, where we expect decision-making authority to not necessarily be held by someone up there, but that it would be more at any level, right? Like, and that gets reflected in flat organizational structure where, like, at Southwest Airlines, they talk about this all the time, right? That the ticket agents have a lot of decision-making authority and don't have to go to a boss for approval because power distance in the US is quite relatively low. So in China, I guess what that 80 would suggest is that you'd expect people to have to get approval from a superior to make that kind of change to their job, and somewhat less is that the case in Japan.
Chinese are much powerful, higher level people.
Or they expect kind of direct authority and power to exist in a certain place, yeah.
I was just wondering if you had looked at, in regards to the Hofstede cultural values comparison, if you had looked at the masculinity statistic at all and how that might relate to your research.
Yes. So when I was looking at this to put this slide together, my recollection is that there's not a huge difference between China and Japan on masculinity. Is that?
We're about to find out.
Because I recall that I was like looking for, okay, where are the big differences on these 5 or 6?
There's actually a pretty big difference. China's at 66, which is weird to me, and Japan is at 95.
95.
It's
So
weird
okay,
to
so
me because China is like a lot of guys because they sent all the girls away.
right. So that value, right, is the degree to which behaviors, and I for me, Hofstede, that masculinity value is loaded, but like the degree to which behaviors that are considered to be masculine, so like aggressiveness and are more highly valued by the culture. So I guess the question that I would have is, okay, there's a difference. Why does the difference suggest more job crafting in Japan? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that, right? Like, okay, yeah, Japan puts higher value on masculine behaviors. Why does that mean people will do this particular thing more? I don't know.
Okay.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
I'm curious as to, well, you suggested that maybe that you would enjoy it or appreciate it if you were able to study from a larger number of countries.
Yeah.
But I'm curious as to whether you have any ideas in place on to study these two countries historically. I mean, because of certain aspects, such as the fact that Japan doesn't really change the title of jobs often, it might be more difficult, but perhaps you could examine the cultural output to see like stories about job crafting and such.
Yeah, that was right. That might be really interesting. Like, I would think if you went and looked at, if you could figure out how to do this, but amount of job crafting in Japan in 1980 compared to amount of job crafting in Japan in 2010, like, should be really different. You would think, right? To what extent? How did the quote unquote lifetime employment system influence this? There's an argument to be made that the lifetime employment system suggests even more job crafting, right? Because if you're going to be in the same company from 22 until 65, right, you got to find a way to keep that fresh and keep that interesting as an employee, because your option is not leave to find a different job to do. And so, that would be really interesting. A data set where you could do that kind of research, it would be interesting to sort of think about what that would look like. I mean, is it newspaper and magazine studies or what? I don't know. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
All right, so thank you so much. It was so interesting. Great, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.